All right, so we're going to be talking about a couple more shortcuts today. Yesterday we talked about the first two that we learned. So side, side, side. So that meant that all three sides of each triangle were congruent to each other. We also talked about side, angle, side. So two of the sides and the angle in between those two sides were congruent. So today we're going to be talking about the ASA and the angle, or in the AAS. So angle, side, angle, 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 side. So some of you may be able to guess what those two things mean, hopefully. But let's get into it. So angle, side, angle means that we have two angles that are congruent in a triangle, and then that side in between the two angles is also congruent. So for example, I know that angle N and angle H are congruent. I know that angle K and angle G are congruent. And then GH and KN are congruent to each other. So notice that these two angles are the congruent ones, and the side in between the two angles, or touching the two angles, is also the congruent side. Same down here. So angle, angle, and then side in the middle, or in between them. It's touching both angles. So in example 1, we got to prove that triangle ABD is congruent to triangle EBC. So let's start with what they give us. So we know that DB is congruent to CB. So hopefully some of you are saying, well, we got two lines that cross each other right here. Let's see, it's green. So these two are vertical angles. So when two lines cross, the opposite angles, our vertical angles, are congruent. So angle ABD is congruent to angle EBC. So far, we have a side, we have an angle. So since we're taking notes on angle, side, angle, we're probably going to get another angle in there somewhere. But how do we find that angle? Well, notice we got this little thing right here, this little arrow. So hopefully you remember from previous lessons, or from last year, that little arrow means these two lines are parallel. So AD and CE are parallel. So that's going to be important in helping us find which angle is congruent to another one. So if you remember, this line that touches the two parallel lines is called a transversal. So if I'm looking at angle D right here, it's above the transversal. If I look at angle C right here, it's below the transversal. So they are on alternate sides. They're not on the same side. They're on alternate sides of the transversal. And notice that these two parallel lines, the two angles are in between them. So hopefully some of you remember that these are called alternate interior angles. So these two angles are congruent because of alternate interior angles. So angle D has to be congruent to angle C. So that would be another angle. So now we'll have three things. So I got to look at what order they go in. So we got an angle. Let's use gray. So angle, then the side, and then the angle. So notice that if we look at the two angles, this side is touching both of those angles, or it's in between both of those angles. Same with this. The side is in between or touching both the angles. So that means we're going to be using angle, side, angle. So I can say triangle ABD is congruent to triangle EBC by the angle, side, angle postulate. So that one's kind of tricky because we had to remember alternate interior angles. So example 2. So I recommend you pause the video and try this one on your own. So first thing I'm going to do is write everything down that I know. So I know this angle and this angle is congruent, so I got an angle. I know. Let's see, let's use green. This side right here is being shared by this triangle and this triangle. This side is going to be the same length for this triangle as it is for this triangle. So this side is going to be the same length for each triangle. So that's the side. And then we also know that these two angles are supplementary. So if one's 90, the other one has to be 90. So we have two 90-degree angles, so those are congruent. So I got an angle, that was an angle, and then the green was the side. So now I look at what order they go in. So angle here, then a side, then an angle. So notice we have two angles. This line touches this angle, it also touches this angle. So that means the line is in between them, same on the other triangle. So that means that the triangles are congruent to each other by angle, side angle postulate. So moving on to the next page. This time we're going to be talking about AAS, or angle, angle, side. So it's pretty much the same thing, just in a different order. So first thing I'm going to look at, whatever they give me. So in this example, angle C and angle X are congruent. Angle D and angle G are congruent. And then DM, oops, that was not a very good trip line. And angle TG are congruent. So notice that we have two angles and the line is not in between those two angles this time. It's not touching both of those angles. So that's why it's angle, angle, side. So in example 3, oh look, we get to do a proof. I know all of you love doing proofs, but it's just something we're going to have to do a lot this semester, so you might as well get used to it. So when we're doing proofs, for the reasons, almost always the first thing that you're going to put is given, but verify to make sure that's correct. So they tell us that VW is congruent to UW. So VW is congruent to UW. They did tell us that, that is given. So that is true because they have that little tick mark there. So that's given. Next thing they tell us is that angle X is congruent to angle Z. So angle Z and angle X have that little arc there. So that is also given. So far it's been pretty easy, just writing down given things. All right, so reflexive property. Now I kind of mentioned this previously. The reflexive property just means that something is equal or congruent to itself. So since we just talked about the angle, angle, side theorem, we're probably going to be using that. Also, a lot of times, for me included in this, but a lot of times it'll be easier if you draw these triangles separate, because it's kind of hard to tell what's going on when they're all together like that. Hopefully you can draw better than I can. So those are the two triangles. We were given that this side and this side are congruent, and then this angle and this angle are congruent. So we have an angle and then the opposite side, angle, opposite side. So is there any side or any angle? Well, since we're doing AAS, probably gonna be another angle, because so far we have a side and an angle. So if we're using AAS, we need another angle. So is there any angle out of the three angles in each of these triangles, any angle that's being shared by both those triangles? Well, angle W is being used by both triangles. So that would be this angle and then this angle. Oops. So now we have our angle, angle, side. So notice that this side does not touch both of these angles. This side does, but we're not using that one. We're using this side, so it's angle, angle, side. Oh, this is angle W congruent to angle W. And then this would be AAS. And then finally, example 4, are the triangles congruent? Well, we know that angle E and angle J are congruent. EF and JH are congruent. So again, I know that E and J match up together, so that's why I put E first and J first. So there's one other thing that we know. So hopefully I've mentioned this a few times throughout this unit, but we got two lines crossing each other. So whenever we have two lines crossing, we know that the opposite angles are vertical angles, and which are congruent. So since we already used the one little arc, we need to use two arcs here. So that means the angle EGF is congruent to angle JGH. So this was an angle, this was a side, this was an angle. So now I have three things I just have to figure out what order they're in. So the blue side is the side we used. Then I got an angle and an angle. Whoops, did not mean to do that. So if these are the two angles we used, the blue side is not touching both. The blue side is only touching this angle. It's not in between. So it would be angle, angle, side. So triangle EGF is congruent to triangle JGH by angle, angle, side. Postulate. And that's it.